My father recently passed away, as many of you will know, and that made me contemplate this topic of mortality in our practice. For many of us, the topic of death, of mortality, is something that we strive to avoid. We distract ourselves and push the topic aside. But in Buddhism, mortality is actually a core practice, a contemplation of our mortality, of death itself. So let's consider what if contemplating our mortality wasn't depressing, but instead liberating. So in today's video, I want to discuss a little bit about how this contemplation fits into the early practices in Buddhism, how those also deal with the broader topic of impermanence, and how we can bring this into our lives today. First, I want to touch on death as a contemplative practice in early Buddhism. Many of us may not realize that in fact the earliest teachings on mindfulness meditation included as a central part a meditation on death, where monastics were supposed to go to charnel grounds, that's grounds where they would leave out dead bodies to decay. Either they would go to those charnel grounds, or they would at least contemplate being in such charnel grounds, contemplate the decay of these bodies around them, and make that an element of their meditation, mindfulness meditation practice, with the thought that their own body was no different from these bodies around them, that they were also subject to death and decay, and they were not able to go beyond that. Their bodies were not going to be permanent. Now, one question that may arise for us is, why do this? Why focus on something that seems, let's say, so macabre? Well, it's not to induce in us depression or anxiety or a sense of nihilism or anything like that. Instead, it's meant to help us to organize our priorities, to reduce our tendency to become attached to the body and to other physical things. This, indeed, was one of the reasons behind what are known as the 5 reflections that the Buddha recommended both monastics and lay people reflect upon and think about every day. The Buddha said, "I am liable to grow old. I am not exempt from old age. A woman or a man, a layperson or a renunciate should often review this. I'm liable to get sick. I'm not exempt from sickness. I'm liable to die. I'm not exempt from death. I must be parted and separated from all I hold dear and beloved. I am the owner of my deeds and heir to my deeds. Deeds are my womb, my relative, and my refuge. I shall be the heir of whatever deeds I do, whether good or bad." Now, these sober reflections on the part of the Buddha are very akin, very similar to what are known as the memento mori, the mementos, the remembrances of death that we find in the Western tradition, both philosophical and religious. Many of us, if we've been to museums, may recall having seen paintings or pieces in churches with skulls and bones that are supposed to remind us that we too are mortal. Now again, the point of these memento mori, just like these remembrances that the Buddha suggests, are not to get us depressed and sad, but rather to help us to focus our priorities. When we have this kind of true insight and awareness of our own mortality, it helps us to give up our trivial distractions and grudges and concerns and focus on what's truly important to us. In a couple of suttas in the Pali tradition, the Buddha recommends his monastics to focus on death and remembrance of death for just that purpose. In other words, to focus the mind on one's practice in order to increase zeal for practice, increase zeal for getting things done. The Buddha says we should practice as if our head were on fire, our clothes were on fire, because death can come at any time. Now, this reflection on death can actually be liberating. And this is I think the upshot of one early story that we find in a commentary to the poems of the earliest nuns. In this commentary, we find the story of Kisa Gotami. Kisa Gotami was an early nun. Before she became a monastic, she had a child, a boy, and that boy died in infancy. And his death drove her to the brink of insanity. And she would carry around his dead body from, it said, from doorway to doorway, looking for somebody who could give her medicine to revive her child. Eventually, it said, according to the story, that she got to the Buddha's place, where he was residing, and the Buddha told her that he could make a potion for her if only she could find mustard seeds from the houses of those people who had not experienced death. And so it's said that Kisa Gotami went out, and indeed the first doorway she got to, she asked them if they had mustard seeds. They said yes. She said, "I need mustard seeds from a house of people who have not experienced death," and the people in the house said, "Well, we're very sorry. In fact, we've experienced plenty of death in this house, so our mustard seeds would be no good to you." And then the commentary goes on, and going to a second and a third house, her madness left her, and her right mind was established, thanks to the power of the Buddha. She thought, "This is the way it will be in the entire city. By means of the Blessed One's compassion for my welfare, this will be what is seen." And having gained a sense of spiritual urgency from that, she went out and covered her son in the charnel ground. She uttered this verse, "It's not just a truth for one village or town, nor is it a truth for a single family, but for every world settled by gods and men, this indeed is what is true, impermanence." By realizing this universality of impermanence and therefore of death, her sorrow became depersonalized. It wasn't just about her. It wasn't about her and her son. She hadn't been somehow picked out and chosen and made to suffer unreasonably, but rather the same sorrow that she felt was felt by everybody, because everybody experienced this kind of death. Second, I want to turn to this relationship between death and impermanence, because this fact of mortality is simply an expression of the deeper fact of the impermanence of all conditioned things. Everything that arises will pass away. This awareness is, of course, as I've said before, not intended to be depressing, but instead to be truly liberating. Because at the end of the day, the problem isn't death, it isn't mortality, it isn't even change and impermanence. It's rather that we tend to cling to things that cannot last. There's a great example by the contemporary or recently passed away meditation master, Thai meditation master in the Thai forest tradition, Ajahn Chah, who talks about a glass. Whenever you use this glass, you should reflect that it's already broken. Do you understand this? The Buddha's understanding was like this. He saw the broken glass within the unbroken one. Whenever its time is up, it will break. Develop this kind of understanding. Use the glass, look after it, until when, one day, it slips out of your hand, smash, no problem. Why is there no problem? Because you saw its brokenness before it broke. But usually people say, "I love this glass so much, may it never break." Later on, the dog breaks it. "I'll kill that damn dog." You hate the dog for breaking your glass. Usually people crave permanence. They'll cling to the glass. But realizing its essentially broken nature, its nature of dukkha, of impermanence, of unsatisfactoriness, is actually liberating. The Buddha's final teaching was of this nature. His final words to his Sangha were, "Conditioned things fall apart. Persist diligently. All cups will eventually break. All beings will eventually die, even the Buddha himself." This is not meant to be a counsel of despair, but rather a counsel of freedom. That is, becoming aware of what's truly important to us and focusing on that. Persist diligently. Third, I want to touch on 4 ways that this kind of contemplation of change and death can help us in our daily life. First of all, it can help us to reduce our craving and clinging, our craving for permanence and clinging to objects that cannot persist forever. So, for example, in this regard, we can once again think about Ajahn Chah's example. If we're aware of the essential brokenness of the glasses that we hold in our daily life, we're less likely to cling to them, less likely to assume that they will persist forever, as the person did in the story, who then ended up blaming his dog. In a sense, everything we ever interact with is already decayed and broken. This kind of realization can help us live freer and more open lives, because we're no longer beset by delusions about what's going to persist. Second, this kind of contemplation can help us release our grudges and our conflicts. Just as Kisa Gotami was able to overcome her madness through an awareness of the universality of change and death, so too an awareness of the universality of change and death can help us to give up our trivial grudges and arguments with other people. When we realize that we're all mortal, we're all going to pass away, that all of our trivial petty angers and hatreds and grudges against this person or that person are, in the eye of eternity, going to be just so much history, just history as much as ancient Rome is now history to us. Knowing this, what's the point of spending time on these kinds of pointless grudges? Third, this kind of contemplation of mortality can actually paradoxically help us find more joy in the present. As we become more intimately aware of the fact that life is short and that we will eventually die, it makes our life more vivid. We can perhaps turn off the autopilot for a moment when we realize that we are only here temporarily. It also may help us to stop postponing our own happiness. Many of us may have heard of people who work extremely hard their entire lives with an eye towards an eventual retirement, at which point they will be truly happy. And then when they stop working, they pass away in a very short period of time and are unable to actually enjoy their own retirement that they've waited their whole lives for. If instead we can consider perhaps reorganizing our lives in order that we may have happiness right now, along with whatever work we may need to do, we may find that a more fulfilling way to live. This is a matter of wisely figuring out our priorities. And again, a contemplation of mortality can help us do just that. And fourth, these kinds of contemplations can, of course, help us deal wisely, more wisely, with grief and with loss. We will all, of course, experience grief in the loss of those who are dear to us. But being aware of and keeping in mind and keeping close to our hearts these facts, these truths of impermanence and death and mortality, can help us react more wisely in the same way that we remember from the story of Kisa Gotami, who, when she realized the universality of death, the universality of change and impermanence, was more able to come to terms with the death of her child. Fourth, in conclusion, death is a teacher to us. The Buddha did not suggest that we simply fear death, and certainly not that we avoid it, but rather that we focus on it and try to learn from it, that we try to gain insight from the awareness of change and death in our own lives and the lives of everyone around us. Contemplating death regularly in this way can help us to overcome our fears and anxieties. It can help us to reorder our lives into ways that are more intentional and more freeing. My question to you is, have you ever had an experience where this kind of awareness of impermanence, of mortality or death, helped life seem freer to you or made life seem more precious to you? If you want to hear more about these 5 contemplations that the Buddha recommended for lay people and monastics, I did a prior video on these 5 reflections, and I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to refresh your memory. Thanks so much. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.